They laughed at the bum on stage, but he surprised everyone. That night there was something in the air that the people of that small town in the Midwest couldn't name. It was a strange tension, almost like when rain is slow to come and the sky hangs heavy, loaded, waiting. The community hall was full, every chair taken, and no one, absolutely no one, could have imagined that that night would change a lot of things, not just on stage. Inside, a lot of the people sitting there thinking they'd only come to have a good time. The talent show was simple. Every year the neighborhood community board put it together, and every year it was the same thing. Kids singing off-key, young folks strumming guitars to top 40 hits, an old man reciting cowboy poetry. Fun, charming, but no surprises. This year there were 3 judges sitting behind a long lit table, each one holding a scorecard and a pen. On the left, a man in a suit who thought he was more important than he really was. In the middle, an elegant woman who taught singing at a school in the next county seat. And on the right, a bald-headed man, stern, arms crossed, who had played in wedding show bands in the 80s and 90s, and now lived off whatever was left of that memory. Nobody paid much attention when he walked in through the back of the hall, but the woman at the registration table did. Esther was 63 years old and had an elephant's memory for faces. When that man in a worn blue coat approached, carrying an old guitar tied up with twine, she kept staring. Something familiar was hidden in that face, behind the long, messy white beard, behind the dark wool cap covering his forehead, behind the deep, tired eyes. She stood there with her pen in hand, not writing a thing. "Can I sign up?" he asked. His voice was deep, hoarse from the cold, or from time. Esther blinked. "Sure you can. Name?" "Silas. Silas Mitchell." And then the world stopped for her. Silas Mitchell. Silas. She had been his student. 32 years ago at a public school right here in this small town, when he taught music to kids from 5th to 9th grade. He was a teacher with a radio voice, the kind of teacher you never forget, the kind who makes you love something forever. She learned to read sheet music because of him. She learned that a song could save you from a bad day. And now he was standing in front of her, with that patched-up coat, with the guitar that looked older than the two of them combined, with the smell of someone who had spent more nights outside than inside anywhere. She wrote down his name. She didn't ask questions. It wasn't the time. When his name was called, more than an hour later, there were maybe 250 people in the hall, and when Silas climbed the 3 steps leading up to the stage, carrying that old guitar, with the blue coat full of stains and tears, with the cap on his head and the beard covering his whole face, the laughter was immediate. It wasn't a quiet laugh. It was a full hall laugh, open, shameless. The man in the suit on the left side of the table leaned over and whispered something in the ear of the woman in the middle, and she covered her mouth, trying to hold back her laugh. The bald man on the right had a smirk at the corner of his mouth, the kind of smile that says you already know what's going to happen, and it isn't going to be anything good. From the audience, someone said out loud, "That one really came off the street." And more laughter. Silas stood still in the center of the stage. He didn't look at the audience. He didn't look at the judges. He stared at a fixed point ahead, somewhere no one else could see. And with a calm that didn't match any of it, he settled the guitar on his lap, adjusted his arm, and stayed quiet for a second. Just 1 second. "I need to stop here and tell you something." When I was researching this story, someone who was in that hall described that moment to me. She said that that second of silence before he began was the longest second she had ever lived inside a closed space. And I understood perfectly. The first chord came out clean, too clean for a guitar in that condition. It was as if the instrument held something that its appearance didn't show. And then Silas's voice came out too, and the laughter died. It didn't fade away slowly. It died for good, as if someone had switched off a light. His voice was one of those voices you feel in your chest before you understand it with your head. Deep, full, with a texture that only comes from many years lived, from much swallowed and much that stayed inside with nowhere to go. He was singing an old song, one of those from past decades that you think you've forgotten, but that comes back whole when you hear it again, with the melody and the lyrics and everything the song carried when life was different. The woman who taught singing froze with her pen in midair. The man in the suit stopped smiling, and in the fourth row to the left of the center aisle, a 40-something man who had come by chance because a friend insisted the festival was lively, went white as a sheet. That man's name was Julian Mitchell, and Silas was his father. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing, Julian and Silas hadn't spoken in 11 years. 11 years is too long. It's enough time for one person to think they've healed, for another person to think they've been forgotten, and for neither of them to be right. The story between them was long, as every story that truly hurts tends to be. There wasn't a single reason. That kind of clean breakup you can explain in one sentence. It had layers. There was a marriage that lasted longer than it should have. There was a woman named Martha, who left when Julian was 12 and never came back. There was a father who sank after that, in a way the 12-year-old son had no way of understanding, and the 20-something son didn't know how to forgive. There was also the school. The day Silas lost his teaching position. It had been an administrative mess, an accusation that later proved false, but that had already done the damage when the truth came out. He was removed, then reinstated, but a reputation in a small place can't be undone. People keep looking away, keep whispering, and Silas kept shrinking inside, little by little, until the space he occupied in the world became smaller than what fit inside him. Julian was 22 when his father left home for the last time, with a backpack and the guitar. He said he was going to visit a cousin in a town on the Jersey Shore. He didn't come back, didn't call, didn't send word. For about 3 years, Julian still tried to make contact. Then he stopped. He built his life, got married, had 2 children, worked, put down roots. But there was a part inside him that never closed properly, like a window that didn't quite fit in its frame and always let a little cold air in. And now he was sitting in that chair, listening to his father sing. The song ended. The hall fell quiet for one more moment, and then came the applause. It wasn't that polite applause at the end of a performance. It was another kind of applause, the kind the audience lets out when it's been caught by surprise and can no longer pretend it was expecting that. The woman in the corner of the second row was crying. A young man who was filming everything on his phone had stopped filming and was just watching, with his phone dangling in his hand. The judges looked at each other. The man in the suit gave a high score without saying a word. The woman who taught singing wrote something on the scorecard for a good while, before turning the paper over and showing it. The man with the shaved head stared at Silas for about 5 seconds before raising his placard. Top score from all 3. The crowd reacted with a noise that shook the wooden walls of the hall. Silas looked at the audience then, for the first time since he'd stepped up, and it was in that moment that his eyes met Julian's. Neither of them moved. Silas came off the stage without giving an interview, without speaking to anyone. Esther found him in the hallway, outside the hall, sitting on a concrete bench with his guitar on his lap. "I recognized you," she said, sitting down beside him. "I know," he replied. "You always had those eyes that don't miss a thing." She smiled, a sad kind of smile. "You were good in there, like you always were." Silas looked at the ground. The night was cold, and the cicadas were singing outside as if they didn't know a thing. Julian was in the crowd, he said. A statement, not a question. "I saw," Esther said. They sat in silence for a while. She didn't ask how he'd gotten there, didn't ask where he was living. It wasn't the time for that. There were things that needed space before they could fit into words. When Esther left to go get her daughter inside the hall, Silas was left alone on the bench, and that was when Julian appeared through the side door, hands in his pants pockets, looking at his father like he was trying to confirm something he still didn't want to fully confirm. "Dad," he said. Just that, one word. But it carried 11 years inside it. Silas didn't answer right away. He raised his face slowly, looked at his son. Julian had his grandfather's face. Always had. That same strong jawline, that same broad forehead. But the eyes were Martha's. Always were. And that had always been hard for Silas, not because he blamed the boy he never had, but because looking at his son was, in some way, also looking at everything that had been lost. "You've grown," Silas said. It was a silly thing to say. But sometimes silly things are the only ones that find their way to your mouth when your heart is too full. Julian took a step, stopped, took another. He stood a yard from his father. He stood looking at that blue coat full of patches, at that wool beanie, at that beard that was completely white now when before it still had dark tufts. And something happened in Julian's eyes that wasn't anger, and wasn't relief, and wasn't just sadness. It was all of it together, in that way that has no name because language hasn't created a word for a feeling that comes layered like that. "Where were you?" Julian asked, and his voice came out thinner than he wanted it to. 11 years. Where were you?" Silas took a deep breath. There was no good answer to that question. He knew it. But there was a difference between not having a good answer and not having any answer at all. "Here and there," he said. "In a town on the Jersey Shore for a while. In a small industrial town in the Rust Belt after that. I kept moving." He paused. "When you lose your way, Julian, it's not that you choose to walk crooked. It's that the ground disappears beneath your feet and you walk until the ground shows up again." Julian stayed quiet. Inside the hall, the next performance had started, and you could hear the muffled sound of an electronic keyboard. "You could have called," Julian said. "At some point in those 11 years, you could have picked up a phone and called." "I could have," Silas agreed. "You're right." That wasn't what Julian expected to hear. When you brace yourself for a fight, the other side agreeing throws you off balance. He stood there, rearranging things in his head. "I was ashamed," Silas went on. "When shame gets too big, it turns into fear, and fear makes you disappear." He looked at his son. "I'm not trying to justify myself. I'm trying to explain myself, which is different. There are things you hear and you feel like you know that pain from somewhere. This part hit me in a way I didn't expect." Julian looked at the old guitar on his father's lap. "You never stopped playing?" "Never," Silas said. And for the first time in that conversation, something different appeared in his voice. It wasn't exactly pride. It felt more like relief, as if that was the only thing he could say about himself that needed no explanation at all. Julian nodded slowly. He sat on the bench, leaving some space between them. He hadn't gotten close enough to be a touch, but he'd gotten close enough to be a presence. And sometimes presence is where it all starts. "I have 2 sons," Julian said after a while. "The oldest is 8, the youngest is 5. Silas kept staring ahead without saying anything. "They don't know they have a grandfather," Julian went on. "I never knew what to say." And then Silas closed his eyes for a second, and when he opened them, they were full of something he hadn't let show like that on the outside, where someone else could see in a long time. "What are their names?" he asked. "The oldest is Caleb. The youngest is Leo." Silas repeated the names softly, as if he were tucking them away. They stayed out there a while longer, while the festival went on inside. No one came looking for either of them. Esther, inside, kept an eye on the door, but didn't step out. She knew there were things that needed to happen without a witness. It wasn't a movie reconciliation. It wasn't a hug with music in the background and everything resolved. It was a hard conversation, interrupted by long silences, with Julian talking about things that had been kept locked away for years, and Silas listening without trying to soften it, without trying to downplay it. Some of Julian's hurts were justified, and others came from a place that would need more time to be untangled, and Silas knew that. He didn't try to fix everything that night. But before Julian got up to leave, he asked one thing. "Where are you sleeping tonight?" Silas hesitated. "There's a blanket I left in a corner near the square." Julian was quiet for a while. He looked at his father. He looked at the ground. He looked at his father again. "Come," he said simply. "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing." Silas didn't answer right away. There was a part of him that wanted to refuse, not out of pride but because he was afraid. Afraid of stepping into a warm place after so long on the outside and not knowing how to behave anymore. Afraid of being one more burden on a son who had already carried so much. Afraid, too, of wanting to stay, of getting used to it, of having it taken away later. "You don't owe me anything," Silas said. "I know," Julian said. "I'm not doing this out of obligation." And that was enough. Esther saw them leaving together through the side gate, father and son side by side, the old guitar swinging in Silas's hand. She stood at the window watching until the two of them turned the corner. Then she turned and went to sit in the back of the hall and listened to the last festival contestant finish singing. Silas spent the night in the guest room of Julian's house, which was a simple, tidy home on a quiet little street. He slept in a bed with clean sheets for the first time in longer than he wanted to count. In the morning, he woke up before everyone else and sat on the porch with the guitar on his lap, playing softly so he wouldn't wake anyone. It was the oldest grandson who found him like that. Caleb was 8 years old and had the natural curiosity of someone who hasn't yet learned to ask questions carefully. He showed up on the porch in his pajamas, barefoot, with his hair sticking up, and stood looking at the old man with the white beard playing guitar. "Are you the grandpa?" the boy asked. Silas stopped playing. He looked at the boy. He was quiet for a moment, because the word had landed on him in a way that needed a second to settle. "I am," he said. Caleb went and sat next to him right up close without any ceremony. "You play well. My dad said you won a contest yesterday." Silas looked over at the kitchen window, where Julian had appeared and was watching the scene from a distance, with a mug in his hands. They looked at each other. Julian didn't say anything, just gave a subtle nod, almost imperceptible. A small gesture, the most important approval Silas had received in many years. "I've been playing for a long time," Silas told his grandson. "Do you want to learn?" Caleb considered the question with the seriousness of an 8-year-old who takes things seriously. "Can you teach?" "I taught a lot of people in my life." "Then you can teach me," Caleb decided, as if the matter was settled. And Silas laughed. A real laugh coming from a place he thought had dried up. The porch was cold. The sun hadn't fully warmed things up yet. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen, and that 8-year-old boy was sitting next to him, waiting for the first guitar lesson of his life. Things weren't completely resolved, because that's not how real life works. Julian and Silas had 11 years of distance to cross, and they weren't going to cross it in one night or 1 week. There were conversations that still needed to happen. There were hurts that needed time, not rushing. There were things Silas would need to change in himself, and he couldn't promise he'd change overnight, because easy promises are the kind that break more than they heal. But there was also Caleb beside him on that porch, and there was Leo, the little one, who showed up right after dragging a teddy bear and stood watching his older brother learn hand placement on the guitar from that old man with the long beard who was the grandfather he didn't know existed. And there was Martha, who that same week made a point of sitting down with Silas at a coffee shop and asking gently but without beating around the bush if he wanted to go back to teaching music. She was part of a group of women who organized cultural activities in the neighborhood, and she'd spent 3 months trying to find someone to teach guitar to the kids, with no luck. Silas heard the offer in silence, asked for a few days to think about it. But we all know that when someone with a gift spends their whole life trying to keep it locked away, and someone opens the door and says, "Come in, you can bring that with you," the answer is already made before the mind even knows it. 3 weeks later, Silas gave his first lesson in a small room provided by the neighborhood community board, with 7 kids sitting in chairs smaller than the guitars they were trying to hold. He'd arrived early. He'd swept the room. He'd arranged the chairs in a semicircle. Julian came to pick up his father that day. He stood at the door of the little room, looking through the windows, while Silas taught the kids how to position their fingers on the strings. His father's posture was different in that place, straighter, more present, as if the classroom gave back to him something that belonged to him and had been stored away all those years, waiting. Silas didn't stay at Julian's house forever. At some point, when he was more stable, he moved into a rented little room near the community center. But he spent weekends at his son's house. He taught Caleb guitar every week. Leo was still too little for a real lesson, but he sat nearby listening, and sometimes tried to imitate the chords with his tiny fingers. Julian's wife was named Audrey. It took her a while to trust Silas, and Silas understood that. He didn't push, didn't try to rush it. He let time do its work, which was the only thing he still knew how to wait for patiently. And Martha there, 63 years old, with that smile that wouldn't fit on a younger face, watched it all from a distance, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knows she planted something good without needing to show up at the harvest. At that festival that happened again the following year, Silas was invited to perform once more. This time, not as a participant, as a special attraction. He stepped onto the stage with the same guitar, the same wool cap, the same blue coat. But there was something different about him that the people in the audience felt without being able to name precisely. It was as if the weight he carried before was a little lighter. It hadn't disappeared, because some things never disappear, but it was distributed differently, like when you learn to carry a heavy backpack in the right spot on your back. It's still heavy, but it hurts less. In the audience, in the third row, Julian was sitting with Audrey on one side and Caleb on the other. Leo was on his father's lap, holding an ice cream that was melting faster than he could eat it. Esther was a few rows back, next to her daughter. When Silas started to play, Caleb leaned toward his dad and said, in that child's voice that doesn't know everyone can hear, "That's Grandpa." And Julian said, "That's Grandpa." End of story. Sometimes I find myself thinking about how many stories like this pass us by without us ever stopping. A man stepping onto a stage, a whole hall laughing, and underneath all of that, a father and a son who had 11 years of silence, waiting for the right moment to give way. I don't know what brought you here today, but I'm glad you stayed until the end. Tell us what you thought. Do you think Julian did the right thing going to talk to his father that night? Leave it in the comments. I'd love to read your opinion. And if this story moved you in some way, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Thank you so much for keeping me company.